Hello, I want to talk to you for a couple minutes about the importance of learning a language when you go into the culture. I'm just finishing 10 years in Romania and I loved it there. Had a great time, and I'm sure we had influence on the people that we met. But after 10 years, I was never able to fully get the language and feel like I had incarnated into that culture. I did in many ways, but not with the language. And without the language, it made a big difference. The reasons I didn't get the language can be discussed at a different time, and that's not the topic of this video. But what I want to share from you, from my perspective, is what happens when you don't have that language and you're there for the long term. We've been there 10 years, and it's a unique perspective to see the difference over time, what happens when you don't have the language. The first thing that I really noticed was the influence that I could have, especially in group discussions. On a personal level, with those that spoke English, I felt like I had influence, but in a group setting, whether it be a planned group, like a planning meeting for a camp or an event, or an unplanned casual meeting of groups standing around talking and a topic comes up and you want to influence that conversation. There are things that you know that you want to share, but because you're not in the language, you can't follow the flow as it's going on. Even if somebody is translating for you and you're trying to be involved and they want you to be involved, by the time the translation comes to you and you have something you want to interject, they're already past that. And maybe early on you'll interrupt and say, hey, let me back you up a few steps and explain something to you. But the reality is, over time, you're there for the long term. Over time, that wears very thin on you and on them. And you quit saying, hey, wait, can we just back up? I'm sorry you have to wait for me, but let's talk about something you thought you determined a minute ago. And so you just quit doing things, and the influence that you can have in group discussions begins to wane. The second thing that you'll notice over time is the amount of respect that you have from nationals for learning the language or not learning the language. When we first get there, they don't expect you to know the language, so to use one or two words, they're quite impressed, and your respect goes up in their eyes. And as you continue to learn, they're very patient in letting you take the time to learn, and they see that you're trying. And that makes a big difference, and your respect goes up even though you don't know the language. And somebody will say, how long have you been in our country? And you say, well, I've been here 1 year. And they say, oh, and you're trying to use the language. Good job. And after 2 or 3 years, you say, I've been here 3 years. And they say, yeah, it's a difficult language to learn. Appreciate you trying. But when you've been 6, 7, 8, 9 years, those same people will say, now how long have you been in the country? And you say, 9 years. And you don't know our language yet? And so it becomes an issue of respect for you. Not knowing the language brings on a unique sense of loneliness that can't be explained in a different way. There's a loneliness when you're just all by yourself, and it's almost an expected loneliness because there's no one around you. You look around and you're by yourself. But there's a different kind of loneliness when you're in the group and you look around and you see the people that you love and you know they love you. And they're enjoying themselves and having a great time, maybe even in your home. But as they're doing that, you don't know what they're talking about. And you're tired of saying, wait, switch to my language. And so you let them enjoy themselves and you're watching them have a great time. But the reality is you realize you have no idea what they're talking about, what they're laughing at, what their jokes are. You can't be a part of it. And you begin to just stand back in the corner and let them enjoy themselves. And there's a loneliness that sets in that gets very hard to handle when you're with those people that you love and yet you feel all alone. In many ways, I think it's how a deaf person feels in a room full of hearing. When they see everybody interacting and they wish they could be a part of it, but because they can't hear the conversation, they can't read everyone's lips at the same time, they feel isolated. There's an isolation and loneliness that comes from not knowing the language. And those people that love you, if they knew it, they would hurt for you, and you don't want them to hurt for you, but it hurts deeply. And that is something, probably one of the biggest pains that I felt by not being able to get the language. This fourth one has to do with friendliness, and it relates to what I just spoke about. But there comes a point where you used to want to be a part of the action and to be in the conversation with people, to get to know them and them to get to know you, where you get so tired of not knowing the language that you just tend to withdraw and let others develop the relationships and you step aside. And I've noticed that even in the groups of people that I enjoy being with, I'm less and less friendly towards them and more just as an observer. And that gets very difficult. And then I noticed it more when I would go to the park, and I like to jog in the park. And at first, I would greet the guards on the way in and say what little I knew to them, and they were thrilled that I would try to speak with them, and they would try to speak back with me, and I have no idea what they're saying. And I remember thinking, I can't wait until I can have conversations with them. But when I couldn't get the language and I couldn't have those conversations with them, I actually began to be afraid that if I speak to them, they'll want to speak back to me and assume I knew more than I did because I'd been there longer. Then I quit greeting them. I even noticed it when I go into a store and the clerk would try to greet me. And I'd be afraid that they would ask me something I don't know, and so I wouldn't even look at them or respond. And I'm sure I came across as an unfriendly person, which is not who I am at all and not who I want to be. This last one became very difficult for me to recognize at the beginning, but over time I saw this one making a big difference, and that is the expectation of knowledge. What I mean by that is things would be discussed when I'm in the room, but I wouldn't understand what they're saying, and early on I would just try to catch what I could, and it didn't seem to matter. But over time I realized people thought because I was in the room that I understood the things that were being discussed. And if I didn't dispute it, they assumed I agreed. If I didn't agree with it, they assumed I was disputing it and being quiet. And in reality, I had no idea what was being discussed. Details for events. Well, Tom, we told you. No, you didn't. Yeah, you were at the meeting when we planned all this. What can I say? There became an expectation of knowledge, even of testimonies that somebody shared at church, and nobody was standing next to me to translate for me, and they would assume I knew their story. There's just so many times things were said around me that I began to realize there's an expectation of knowledge that I didn't have because I couldn't understand the language. So you might be able to get by with it for 1 or 2 or 3 years and feel like you're doing a good job and even feeling fulfilled in ministry. But if you're in it for longevity, if you want to incarnate into the culture, you have to know the language. It will hurt you in ways that you can't imagine until you've gone through it if you don't learn the language.